Hi, I'm Steve Hassan, and I am so honored to have with me yet again my mentor, Dr. Robert J. Lifton, who has authored a brand new volume, one of many, many books that he's read, and I must confess I've read them all. But I really appreciated reading this small volume because it summarized a lot of your key work, Dr. Lifton, that I've read about, starting with the book that helped deprogram me out of the Moonies. This is the original hardback.
Right.
Forgive
Let's
me,
go back.
but this is the picture of you on the back cover.
I can hardly recognize that young man.
Really, the award-winning book on the psychological effects of the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is a window into your lifelong work against nuclear war and nuclear weapons. Your book on Nazi doctors, which you also reference in the new volume. Here's another one on your anti-nuclear position and how it has extinguished, nuclear bombs have extinguished our desire for symbolic immortality in terms of how to live beyond ourselves, because once nuclear weapons were introduced, we could then visualize the end of everything, except for the transcendent. Your book on the Protean Self and how people adapt and change to different environments, which is critical. And the book that you wrote explicitly, unlike this one, which is on Chinese communist brainwashing, which is very much in the news with the Uyghurs and other minorities, this is your book on the Aum Shinrikyo cult group, the sarin gas cult in Japan, which in fact 60 Minutes flew me over there to be their on-site expert. And with that, Dr. Lifton, we've had a shocking development in international relations with Donald Trump, and maybe I could ask you just to comment about the ordered assassination of the second in command of Iran.
Yeah. Yes, well, that's a dreadful event that endangers everyone and has already caused an upsurge in what might be called universal anxiety in the world because of the danger of actions on the part of Iran in retaliation. So one thing to think about is what enables Trump to do something like this psychologically. And I've written about, in addition to Trump's cult-like behavior, he is completely what I call solipsistic, self-involved, so that every reality he entertains comes exclusively from the self, from what the self experiences, what the self needs, and he can block out all reality around him. That, along with a paranoid cast, is a really dangerous combination. And in a way, it rules out for him the possibility of diplomacy, because diplomacy involves a certain amount of self-negation in the service of one's country's interests and security, and in the service of peace. But if you're functioning only from the isolated experience of the self, together with its paranoia, there's no possibility for diplomacy. And that's a way of looking at what Trump experienced and felt and the way he acted in that assassination.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm just remembering that you wrote the foreword to the volume that forensic psychiatrist at Yale, Bandy Lee, wrote, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, because of her concerns, as yours and so many others, about Donald Trump's capacity for violence and dangerousness.
Yes, and in that forward, I emphasized his imposing on us what I call malignant normality. He imposes as normal constant lying, deep corruption, and this entire solipsism or solipsistic reality,
Yes.
which is unreality in actuality. So that malignant normality, in a way, is something that we have to recognize. And when you and I study these things, we're looking to expose that malignant normality, and we're looking to become what I call witnessing professionals.
Mm-hmm.
Professionals who use our knowledge from our profession. We don't surrender it. Use our knowledge from our profession to expose that kind of malignant normality and become advocates of truth and actual reality. And that's what we try to do in our lives. And I have emphasized this particular pattern in my last few books.
Yeah, thank you so much. You have witnessed so many extremes. And in fact, I didn't pull down from my shelf Witness, to an extreme
century, yeah.
Extreme century, where you cover brainwashing and Nazi doctors and the nuclear bombing, etc. And it's more important than ever that we be heroic resistors also to authoritarianism.
Yes,
where we're being forced to react with fear to people threatening us because we dare to rely on facts.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And one way to put that is to speak of the combination of scholarship and activism, because sometimes, and this has some tradition from German academic life and other sources, but I think it's very misleading. There has been the assumption that scholarship and activism are totally separate and ne'er the twain shall meet.
Yeah.
But actually, I would reverse that and say that good scholarship has this element of witness, and it is best combined with activism, which gives scholarship its purpose. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, also, activism is much benefited by disciplined scholarship because it enables us, it helps us to direct our activism more effectively and logically. So I see scholarship and activism as reinforcing and benefiting each other.
Yeah.
And that's never been more important than now for us as professionals.
And if I may take this moment to just comment that the American Psychiatric Association's comment on the Goldwater rule that has been, in my opinion and the opinion of other scholars like yourself, is being used as censorship of voices of scholars like Dr. Lee and yourself, Dr. Zimbardo, and so many others, where we can't get into the mainstream media just to witness and say, this is dangerous behavior and people are at risk, as opposed to diagnosing clinically, right?
Yes, exactly.
So comment
really,
about the
really,
rule.
it's even a First Amendment right to speak out, and we must we must avoid the claim, as we do, that we're doing a hands-on diagnosis, as in the case of someone who comes into our office and for whom we become the physician or psychological therapist. That isn't the situation at all. It's rather witnessing in Trump's behavior, which he's extended to many around him, and many around him have come to it on their own, rather seeing the danger that that behavior really creates for us as a society. And that's a way of extending the ethics of our profession. You know, there's been a lot of concern with professional ethics in the last 10 or 15 years, and in that matter, ever since the Nazi doctors, the ultimate violators of medical ethics prior to and during World War II. But professional ethics, they're fine when they advocate that we be disciplined in our work and responsible, and that we enhance the lives of our patients and bring to them the latest in ideas and policies that can help them. That's fine. But professional ethics can go further, and they can have to do with what is happening to and threatening the whole society. And this applies in our remarks about Trump, and it also applies in our work, say, on climate change or in opposing nuclear weapons. So professional ethics have to be, in my view, extended to threats, combating threats to larger groups and to the society in general.
Yes, and I forgot to bring your Climate Swerve book down that you also mentioned in this latest volume about losing reality. But I would like to ask you if you knew some top people in the media were watching your interview, people who have the power to decide whether to have professionals like Dr. Bandy Lee speak about her forensic expertise on dangerousness and why there's a need for a nonpartisan neuropsychiatric evaluation of Donald Trump as soon as possible, even before the Senate gets the impeachment articles. What would you want to say?
It's a very difficult matter. It's a very difficult matter because we must speak out in terms of activism, as I said, as psychiatrists and psychologists. But on the other hand, it's a political process, and it can't necessarily be solved psychologically or psychiatrically. So I think what we must do is urge upon our elected leaders truths about Trump and press them toward means that they can achieve for removing him. Mm-hmm. So I've written a short piece more recently about the relationship between impeachment and reality. In other words, because of Trump and others around him, I see our society as suffering from a national reality disorder. Mm. Many, many people are confused about what's real, what's true, and what is false, and what is created in a way to mislead, and which ignores evidence as opposed to actual evidence. And my claim is that the process of impeachment, with all the pitfalls and all the resistance by Trump and those who support him, has nonetheless a function of combating, or at least diminishing, that national reality disorder that I'm talking about. And we hear again and again in statements from leading voices in the House of Representatives, we hear truths about the society. We return to reality. And that has enormous importance for the society, because one of the worst and most lasting legacies of Trump, and we do have to remember he's not going to be president forever, is precisely that of falsehood and the national reality disorder to which he has so actively contributed.
That's very profound. So there's so many directions I want to go on, but be explicit. If you're talking to people in power of the media, what would you like to see more coverage of, if anything?
You know, there's been a lot of coverage of the psychological statements about Trump. Of course, a lot of resistance to it. That's inevitable. I'd like more coverage of it. I'd like more coverage of why and how Trump is dangerous. There has been increasing coverage of Trump as cult-like. And I try to specify that in my new book and talk about a phenomenon of cultism, which includes a political expression, as in Chinese thought reform, but also religious expressions, as in what we call cults, and the communities, the indwelling communities they form around an omniscient guru. And so I call all of this cultist. And yes, they could cover more of this, but in the end, there has to be a political process to which we contribute with what we take to be important psychological insights.
Yeah, good. So let's use this opportunity now that you've brought up the issue of cultism, of your take in this volume and your thinking about. So when I hear attacks on me, cult, you know, you're ridiculous, Steve. You're in the cult of George Soros or the Democrats. You know, I'd like to hear you, you know, share your thoughts about
Well,
what's going on.
you know, let me start with a cautionary statement. There's no need to dismiss the whole Trump phenomenon as a cult and nothing more. It's also a religious movement. It's also a political movement, and it's got some apocalyptic tendencies in which Trump is seen as the answer, the savior, by many around him in their religious extremism. But having said all that, there is a cult-like element in Trump's behavior that we have to recognize. You can see it actively and hear it in the chanting back and forth. That's the external expression of it. Build the wall. Who will build the wall? Who will pay for the wall? Mexico will pay for the wall. Lock them up. It's like a perverse religious chant back and forth. Mm-hmm. And he becomes guru-like to many people. His most extreme followers give themselves to him, so that, as in cultic behavior, the idea of evidence and truth is lost in favor of a narrative that absolutely idolizes the guru as someone who is omniscient, knows everything, must be followed, whatever is said and whatever evidence for the alternative. There is, for me, though, a hopeful element in this too, in that from my study of other cults, particularly Om Shinrikyo, the fanatical Japanese cult, whose members released sarin gas in Tokyo subway trains in 1995. When Asahara, their guru, who was as omniscient and apocalyptic as any cultic guru ever, when he was revealed to be a criminal and imprisoned and no longer a guru, his very closest disciples, who had absolutely worshipped him and tried to move close to him, become part of him, turned against him. They called him a false guru, an evil man. Their attack was more bitter and vitriolic than that of anyone else. And that's a phenomenon I think we can recognize as taking place when the guru no longer satisfy the needs of followers. Suddenly, he was unable to be their guru, and they were lost and left without him and enraged at him because he could no longer be their guru. So I don't mean that this is suddenly going to happen with Trump or that all of his close followers will turn against him, but some of them will, and there have been rumblings already of some questioning on the part of followers. So that idea of absolutely loyal followers does not necessarily last forever and can indeed be a vulnerability when they turn.
Yeah, and I'm an example of a fanatic follower of Sun Myung Moon, who, when I woke up after my near fatal van crash and my deprogramming, with your book and the 8 criteria of Chinese communist brainwashing being explained to me, and me being able to think, oh, we do the same thing. When I woke up, I became a very public critic of
Yes.
Moon and have
So
dedicated.
you're an example of what I'm describing.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think there's a potential element of parallelism here with Trump and Asahara, in the sense that when it was clearly proven that he was responsible for ordering the sarin gas development and the murder and the setting of the sarin gassing, they couldn't follow him anymore because the bubble burst that he was this great, loving, enlightened spiritual master.
Exactly.
And I honestly think Trump will go to jail if the rules of law and order proceed. As soon as he's no longer president, there are many criminal lawsuits waiting.
Well, that's very possible because he's been corrupt all through his life, and when watches the evidence, when observes the evidence accumulating by good journalism, it's extraordinary how consistent he's been in his corruption and violation of all kinds of laws. But I would add one caveat in the sense that Trump is highly dangerous now, but what he represents doesn't stop with him. There are large numbers of Republicans who have made much of what he says their public advocacy. Mm-hmm. Some of them may be in conflict, but they've been extremely remiss ethically and intellectually in terms of their failure to speak out. And they represented a development in the society that included delegitimation on the part of the extreme Republican message, delegitimation of what used to be considered the loyal opposition. The opposition had no legitimacy. It had to be not only defeated, but obliterated. And that's come from the American right, not only from Trump, but there's been a kind of combination of Trump and that larger tendency. And that makes it especially difficult to get rid of it. But we do still have our institutions to embrace. They are democratic institutions, and as much as he wants to attack them, as he does, our legal institutions, certainly our congressional or congressional institution, and his exaggerated, also those institutions that allow for control of the executive on the part of Congress, they're still active. They're not dead, as much as he may try to destroy them. And in that sense, we have an opportunity in our democracy to confront him. And I also bring about something I could mention in my new book at the end, a mention of what I call the Protean Self. Really, it's a more flexible self, many-sided, can change and be transformed. And it's in keeping with a development in psychology, which looks upon the self as more malleable and less fixed than we used to see it. And this, when it's collective, it can't just be individual. And certainly social psychology is crucial here. When the Protean self becomes collective and when it has itself a basic source of evidence. For instance, we see now the development, and that's what next to my last book, The Climate Swerve, is about. We see a development just in the last 20 years of radical shift in our recognition of climate change and global warming and the causes and effects. And in every study made, this is a striking development of insight. That's why we have now the mentality to confront climate change, though lots of political struggles with resistance to it. So the Protean self, we have within us the capacity to alter the malignant normality thrust upon us. We're not wired to destroy each other, but we're not wired necessarily to build constructively together either. We're wired with either possibility, and then it becomes up to us what we do intellectually and professionally and politically with what we have in this wonderful but dangerous instrument we call the human mind.
Yeah, and great. So I would like to circle back, if I may, to your work with Chinese brainwashing, because it's back in the news. And of course, different than in the 50s, the digital world exists, and the internet and facial recognition cameras and other things that the Chinese are doing. But I'm very interested to hear your comments about, the fact that brainwashing does exist. It's being done, in coercive ways, but it's also was done just through social, psychological pressures and such.
Absolutely. Well, when I did my first study, that of thought reform, a so-called brainwashing, and wrote my first book about thought reform, the Chinese had just taken power and had come in, the Chinese communists had just come into power as heroes in the eyes of many. They had won a civil war against very great odds, had a kind of heroic mythology already in the Great March and in all they'd done. And they carried out their thought reform with a certain amount of effectiveness. It was never perfectly successful. And it was both coercive, it always has been coercive, but also exhortative. It could appeal to idealism, as it did. Over time, they over-reformed, in my view. And I could see this even, toward the end of my early study, and then in connection with a second book that dealt with these issues, Revolutionary Immortality, where the reform process was becoming more and more coercive and less exhortative or inspirational. But they couldn't stop reforming because it has a religious-like impulse in political terms. Mm-hmm. And they did keep reforming. Over time, there have been fits and starts in the amounts of thought reform. It's never disappeared. It has increasingly become coercive and punitive. often emphasizing what the Russians had emphasized, the coercive confession extraction, often with torture in that case.
Mhm.
Now, with the Uyghurs, we see something new. It's really, it's an application of what you can still call a version of thought reform, but in the most extreme and destructive and coercive way. It's an effort to deculturalize a people, to divest them of their religion, of their ethnic roots, and render them all enthusiastic Chinese communists
Right.
rather than Uyghurs who happen to be Islamic and who have their own very strong ethnic traditions.
Right.
This is something new, and with it, they've applied contemporary technologies in which they have all kinds of facial recognition. They can control and follow and completely keep track of large groups of people technologically. Here I made a mistake, or at least said something too quickly in my earlier work, when I talked about Chinese thought reform as opposed to other forms of control. I said the Chinese were less technological and more face-to-face in their thought reform, and they were. And they made use of psychological capacities they developed in Chinese family life, which could be very subtle and psychologically effective. But of course, it turned out they could, as well as anyone, make use of technological devices, of surveillance, of bringing people under control with every form of technology, as well as control through power over them. And the Uyghurs is the most extreme example of all of this, where more than 1 million people have been in camps, in thought reform-like environments that are also prison-like, and in which every level of thought reform has been practiced with less and less pretense of being exhortative, and although still they are trying to win them over, but less and less pretense of being exhortative, and more clarity about being controlling. And here I would invoke, especially in those 8 principles, or what I call the 8 deadly sins, the last and most dangerous one, the dispensing of existence, which really has the assumption that only certain people are deserving of existence, and the thought reformers, those in charge, the totalists, the cultists, can decide who is worthy of existence and who is not. And in effect, they're saying that the Uyghurs are not worthy of existence, except to the extent that they take on the characteristics of Chinese communists and divest themselves of their own ethnic commitments.
Yeah, and I might just say in my work of over 40 years, the dispensing of existence applies to all authoritarian cult groups, where they say if you leave the group, you have no spiritual life, you have no value. In fact, you may be an enemy.
Yes, yes.
To quote Scientology and fair game, you can be lied to and harmed if you're considered to be a threat to
yes,
the
the
control.
dispensing of existence can function at any level. It can just mean that in the society in which this is being expressed, or in the group, you will have a very low position. You'll be prevented from achieving anything more. Or it can mean that you'll be exiled to some rural area and will be related to the central course of society, or at its most extreme, as in the Soviet show trials and in some of Chinese communist behavior, it can mean that you will be killed, you will be executed because you do not have the right to existence, and the cultist figures have the right to the dispensing of existence.
Right. The
Or can
ends,
function at any level.
yeah, ends justify the means. I can't help but think about Hong Kong and even the claims of the Chinese government that Hong Kong schools are brainwashing the young people, and that's why they're protesting for their rights.
Yes. Well, that brings up the word brainwashing and the easy violations of truth in its use.
Mm.
The brainwashing originally came from what was observed in communist China in terms of the thought reform process, but it has an inherently dramatic, melodramatic quality. So, on the one hand, brainwashing was considered sometimes by members of our own CIA and others as some form of mind control that could not be resisted, and that was obscure and obtained by our enemies, something that some Americans thought we should have. But others simply used it on the other extreme for any form of persuasion.
Right.
They're brainwashing him. They're
I'm
they
brainwashed.
tell him, what's that?
I'm being told I'm brainwashed.
Yeah,
The
sure.
liberal media.
You can say, well, they told him that blueberries are good for him. They brainwashed him. So it has meaning at any such level, and you can't get rid of the word because it's popular.
Right.
So what you can do is indicate that it doesn't have much meaning, but you have to also indicate that Chinese thought reform is the accurate term that the Chinese use for what they do, and it's accurate for what goes on in cults in the indwelling groups controlled by the guru, or at least in many cults.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so I guess I want to add that the Chinese government, even though they have a firewall on their internet and they're monitoring everybody's cell phones and all their social media, their reach extends out across the world to all Chinese people who have relatives in China, and they're exerting influence remotely to, in the fear that maybe their relatives might be harmed. But the Chinese government is also like installing high-tech 5G towers and other things to extend their reach around the world, which is very worrying.
Exactly. Well, the Chinese communists are confronted with an insoluble problem. Nobody believes in Chinese communism or in communism in China anymore, except a small coterie of leadership, and one wonders sometimes about their belief. Communism has become no longer an idealistic view or totalistic ideology so much as a science of power, using communist terms and traditions to justify total power. But the Chinese communists have wished to develop and emerge as a great economic power, about which they've somewhat succeeded in doing this. And to do that, you have to open yourself up to various other influences and ideas, and especially in those who go abroad, and even those who stay at home, and even when you try to control the internet and everything else. So here's a country which has moved from a kind of ideologically obsessed country, which it was when I did my study of thought reform in the mid-1950s, to a country in which nobody believes in the communist ideology anymore. And it's become one of the most corrupt countries in the world, with all sorts of advantages to family members of leaders.
Mm-hmm.
So it erupts with nasty violence and control whenever it feels it's being threatened politically, or its leadership is being threatened.
Right.
And in that sense, it still has the most extreme communist reactions of a totalistic and cultist kind, even as it claims to be a great free power that rivals other powers in the world. And no communist country has ever solved the process of carrying through its leadership, changing leadership, because it has claimed in its communist doctrine some ultimate truth that always had to be sustained, despite the real conflicts and antagonisms of actual human beings vying for leadership in changes that may occur. So all that is occurring with China, but the Chinese leadership is now going back to, as really like Trump himself, extreme nationalism, calling forth ancient Chinese traditions, reviving Confucianism, as Mao Zedong did himself, reviving Confucianism even as they attack it as part of the old society, claiming to represent its leaders in the greatest expressions of Chinese culture. So they're doing that, and that is a source of control and considerable popularity for its leadership. But as we come back to the Uyghurs and any group seen as threatening to the Chinese communist leadership, the response can be vicious.
So I want to bring it back to Trump, if I may, in our last few minutes, and hold up your new volume that I really hope people will get and read. It's not too big, but it's
the virtue, it qualifies as a slim volume.
It's a slim volume, but the wisdom in it is profound. And I really, having read all of your books over 40 years, I appreciated you pulling together at this stage of your career, and you're still going strong. I'm thrilled about that. Your chapter on Trump and any other thoughts you think the public needs to really think about.
Well, what I tried to do in that book is give some background to Trump by using excerpts and then new commentaries on various things I've studied and books I've written, from Chinese thought reform and the Cultural Revolution, Aum Shinrikyo, and yes, even Nazi doctors, and show how these have a relationship. And when we come to Trump, what we find, on the one hand, he couldn't look more different from, say, Chinese communist leadership in their ideological phase. He doesn't have any ideology. He changes from day to day with his solipsism. But what he has in common with them is the attempt to own reality. The attempt to own reality. That sounds bizarre. How can anybody own reality? But it's a kind of illusion that totalists and cultists can embrace. And it's Trump's method as well. And reality itself is always a slippery term because there are kinds of large imposed reality that we all are part of, that any society has. For instance, that democracy is a good means of government, or that God exists or doesn't exist. But there's the nitty-gritty factual reality. And when any kind of leader violates that, we're in deep trouble. And Trump violates that in a solipsistic effort to own reality that, as different as it is from Chinese communist totalism, or even the totalism of Sun Yat-sen or Shoko Asahara of Aum, has in common with them this effort to own reality. And that's why, as different as these other groups are that I studied, they have relevance for Trump in this function. And saying something about them helps us understand something about him. I would
demands total loyalty and total dependency, which is what every destructive cult leader demands of their
yes, that's right.
believers.
And every destructive cult leader also seeks to own reality. And the hopeful side of this is that nobody can own reality. There are voices that speak out. There is the factual everyday reality that we all experience, and its clarity in recognizing falsehood and lies. All that's true, but nonetheless, there is this, I think, unique and dangerous process on the part of Trump to impose that reality and to continue to own it in his solipsistic way. It won't succeed. He'll do a lot more harm in his efforts, but he won't succeed.
Yeah, that's a very optimistic place. I think I'm going to wrap up on an optimistic point, honestly, Dr. Lifton. Thank you so much for all of your work, for all of your social conscience and desire to help. I might add, it's more important than ever to revisit your objections to nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, because we're living in an age now where we can extinguish each other, especially if there are apocalyptic other cult leaders that want to bring about the end of this reality, believing falsely that Jesus will come again or Allah will come again. We need to really take strong steps to get rid of nuclear weapons and move to alternative energies that are not nuclear, in my opinion. But in our last few minutes, any last thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners?
Well, this is what I implied before. Let me say it more clearly. These days, such egregious things are done that we become deeply troubled. I mentioned the national reality disorder. More than that, we have, all of us, psychological experience of what's happening because the Trumpist threat enters into our individual psyches. It's not like a separate or distant political issue which can go one way or the other. We feel ourselves threatened, and there's good reason to feel that way. But we also have to recognize that we are part of a democracy where we can still speak out. We can still speak out and be heard. And there are lots of voices that are doing that. And we do have institutions of a democracy, which, though under assault by Trump and really by a whole coterie of followers, nonetheless are not so easily destroyed. So we have great reason for hope, but it's important that each of us combine our scholarship, our thought, our efforts at knowledge with activism toward exposing this malignant normality and taking strong affirmative steps really to protect the openness of our democracy and our lives. And we're capable of doing that.
Yeah, that's great, because so many people that I'm aware of are kind of numb, and they're feeling like
Yes.
learned helplessness,
Yes.
and they're tuning out instead of getting active and organizing locally, even if they don't have the power to organize on bigger levels. People need to really look in the mirror and say, I need to do what I can do to make
That's
the world
right.
a better place.
And there are things we all can do, and everything counts.
Everything counts.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to speaking with you again. One last plug for your latest book and all your other great books. I do want to mention on my website, I have a blog where I detail your writing on the 8 deadly sins, the 8 criteria of Chinese communist brainwashing. I have other interviews that I've done with you in the past on a variety of subjects. And happy, healthy New Year, 2020.
Same to you, Steve, and thank you so much for everything.
My pleasure. Thank you.